going back to the burden of proof, right? We were talking about that. And you have the state of Texas, Utah just passed this as well, is we can deport illegal immigrants here, right? We no longer can trust that the federal government is going to do what they're constitutionally required to do. So we're going to pass our own laws within the state of Utah. Couldn't we just flip it and say, hey, we're going to pass our own immigration rules and we're going to have this cap on this visa for the state of Utah?
Well, that's in a sense, that's what Texas tried to do. So they passed a bill, SB 4, that says they could detain people who aren't here legally. Right. And that's been the subject of this last week. We've had a lot of whiplash on that bill because there was an appeals court that said they couldn't, or a district court that said they could do it, and then appeals court that said they couldn't.
And now we're in a holding
Supreme Court, that said they could, and then it went back to the appeals court, and it's this kind of whiplash. But that's the question. Is can they do that? And here's the legal issue, and we talked about these paradoxes and the tensions, is even within the Constitution, there are tensions built in. Mm-hmm. So it's, one of the articles of the Constitution says that the federal government has control over things like immigration and naturalization. And we've always accepted that they do. I mean, it says there, I believe it's Article 1, Section 8, like this is one of their authorities. But then you've got Article 4 that says that the states have the authority to protect themselves from invasion. So it's the invasion clause. Mm-hmm. So here we have the federal government, and one of the greatest ironies of all is the fact that we have a federal government that's injected itself into every conceivable area of our lives, even as far as our dishwashers, right? Mm-hmm. And yet the one thing that conservatives like me absolutely agree it's their right to do, which is monitoring the border, policing the border, they're actually not doing.
They're not doing it.
So that's, for me, one of the greatest ironies. But again, what Governor Abbott in Texas did is he wrote a letter and he said, look, yes, the federal government has the right to protect the border, but we also have a what may be a contravening or a coexisting right to protect our state from invasion if we believe there's an invasion. And so this gets back to the tension you and I talked about earlier, which is, okay, what's the default? If there is a legitimate question between the two, to where do you default? And my default is almost always the states.
The state.
And in this case, I would say, well, the federal government should do its job.
Yeah.
And they're not. And that's the problem.
It seems to me like it seems like in a court of law, if I was to make the case that there's a willful neglect of the border, it seems like there's enough evidence to show willful neglect.
Well, and the problem is, I think you could make the case because, I mean, a number of our members of Congress have been down there recently, and you've had John Curtis on the show, and John was one of those who recently made the comment. He said, I went down and I talked about this. He said, like, the cartels are controlling the borders. Yeah. Like, he's like, where we were standing, looking at the wall, looking at, people coming through, looking at, ICE agents. He's like, there were lookout towers where the cartels were watching us. Yeah. And the problem is now the cartels have shifted their resources away to some degree from drugs and to human trafficking because the margins are higher. I mean, isn't that?
And there's actually no repercussion. If we send them back, they just make more money when they decide to turn around and come back.
Like a repeat customer.
It's a repeat customer.
It doesn't. Yeah, it's tragic that that's the reality that we have, and that we have a government that's not doing anything about it because there are innocent victims. I mean, and the victims are human beings. And then then we have the issue last year of roughly 3.3 or so million people crossing the border into the United States illegally. I mean, that's roughly the size of the state of Utah. I mean, that's about how many people we have here as well.
Yeah.
So anyway, it's an interesting dilemma, and I think that and to bring this all back to the Attorney General position, this is one of the things that attorneys general do. We have 28 of us in this country that would be Republicans if I were elected. There are 28, and a lot of the power from those positions comes from working together, filing suits, pushing back on strategic areas where you can actually make an impact.
So this was another aha that I had, was these coalitions. These it's basically they're statewide coalitions of attorneys general, right? And so I in the legislature you have proportional amount of representation based off population, but we've capped it at 435 members of the House, right? And we have 2 senators per each state, but there's 1 attorney general in every single state. So we have this level playing field that is being played out in the legal world of the country, and it's a legitimate battle being played out. Right, I think is fair to say.
Well, and it makes sense that
and it's based around party lines too, right? Because you have the Republican Attorney General administration, and you have the Democratic Attorney General, Daga and Raga.
Yeah,
right?
exactly. Yeah,
and so how you have these 2, administrative coalitions essentially, and they kind of battle it out.
Yeah,
quite often. Right?
Well, and
I didn't know that. I had no it just didn't hit my radar.
Well, and crazy. Also it's a somewhat of a new dynamic in our country.
Because, just in basically the last couple decades. Right? Only like the last 20 years.
Yeah, I mean, it's 20 years ago. It was much more I was about to say administrative, but it's not. It's never been an administrative position, but it was less political, and I think now as a group, they're seeing that they can make an impact on policy in ways they couldn't before. Mm-hmm. And I think a lot of this, to be really honest, is a reflection of Congress not doing their job. Mm-hmm. And the fact that all these new agency regulations are popping up that are controlling us here in Utah. I not long ago, I spoke with the Utah Sheriff's Association, and the questions that I got at the end of my speech were all about lands in Utah, and they were from counties like Garfield County, which is where the county seat's Panguitch. So, 90 minutes from here. Yeah. 93% of the county is owned and controlled by the federal government.
Yeah.
And
only 11% of Washington County is owned privately.
Is that what?
11% of Washington County.
I mean, the reality is what can you do then with that? I mean, what it means is the federal government basically owns and controls that land. But it still imposes requirements on the counties. So like Garfield County has the Grand Escalante Monument. Mm-hmm. People will go hiking there. They'll have search and rescues there. The counties are responsible for, all the fees and whatever. And they do get compensated from the federal government, but pennies on the dollar.
As long as they're towing the line. Don't get out of line.
Well, and what they get is like this much.
Yeah.
They call it payment in lieu of taxes or PILT funding. And it's pennies on the dollar of what they could make if it were publicly held privately held.
Yeah.
And so the point of this, and just to kind of bring this back to this whole issue of the federal government overreach, when I worked with Senator Lee, we had in his office, and this was 2015, so it was when Obama was in office, we had this cabinet. It's when you walk in the D.C. office. It was about 4.5, 5 feet tall and about this wide. Mm-hmm. And on the top of the cabinet, we had every bill that had been passed by Congress the previous year. So there were about 600 pages of new congressional laws. So 600 pages. We had it just like sitting on top of the cabinet. In the cabinet were all the new agency regulations passed in the same year. There were 3 individual stacks. If you put them up end on end, it was about 11 feet tall. 60,000 pages. So in other words, and that's just to put in perspective, I mean, that right there, I mean, we got to just let that sink in. That's what's going on in America is for every new congressional law passed, every new one page, there were roughly 100 pages of regulations. So it was like Congress says there shall be clean air, and the EPA says 100 pages later, here's what we think clean air is, and we get to regulate it, and here's what we'll do to you if you don't agree with us. And so that is where the real power is.
All the while, the capitalistic economy that is held all of the stuff together, right, is sitting here trying to make different changes depending on what happens in these regulatory situations, especially when it comes to energy, right? If we land on climate and energy and we change let's just say we're not going to call it climate, we're going to call it energy because truthfully that's what it is, right? We're really debating as to how
we get energy.
How should we do energy, right? And you have, the second largest power, building 300 coal plants, right? This year, 300. They're opening a coal plant like every single 2 a week. Right. And they have 27 nuclear power plants that they're on the books, and we have 1, and we're shutting down all of our coal power plants. And it's like, how when energy is the largest piece of this inflation, if you look at, whenever that's the reason why they pull out, the CPI inflation versus, regular inflation, right? Energy is such this massive part of our life and the residual impact into our economy. And when we put all these regulations in play, how is our capitalistic society supposed to compete with one that's not capitalistic at all and completely controlled?
Exactly.
Right, from the bottom up.
And this, what you just identified, is something that this is going to hit us hard in Utah, because last year,
oh my gosh,
this is the first year.
This is why I had John on. The main reason I had John on, he's running for the Senate, but
to talk about these energy issues.
He's talking about energy. I've tried to kind of ring the bell in southern Utah. I was like, hey, listen, this is going to be a problem for us. We think water's a problem. Energy is going to be a problem for us. We're already, the state of Utah is the second least expensive, right? We have the least expensive energy in almost the entire country. But two of the most expensive in our entire state, two cities, are here in Washington County. We have some of the highest energy bills in all of Utah, and we rank, on the west coast quite high, because a part of our energy is only produced up north, and there's only a few competitors to it, right?
Right. So, and what's interesting is this last year was the first time ever in Utah's history where we used more power than we created. Yeah, so, I mean, and okay, do you remember how earlier we were talking about this bill, SB 57, that flips the narrative in the event Congress asks us to do something? I'll tell you the real driver behind that bill. In fact, you've got a representative here in southern Utah, Colin Jack, who this is his area. I mean, you should chat with him, because he works in this industry, and one of the reasons he pushed this was specifically because of the EPA and their attempts to shut down these baseload power plants. I mean, if there's one issue driving that bill and that paradigm shift that we want to have, it's energy, because there is an EPA rule that is trying to shut down the power plant in the Price area. And the idea is they want it shut down within 8 years. And sure, we can replace it with, say, nuclear, but for a nuclear plant, it's 20 years. Exactly. So we've got a difference of, so there's 12 years there with what? What are we going to do?
And we still have to find somebody to go say, oh yeah, well, I'll invest a couple $2 billion in nuclear energy and not make any money for 20 years. And
right. I mean, the state of Utah is not building these plants.
Exactly.
I mean, we don't want them to. I mean, we want an environment where private companies can come in and do that, but the federal government is stopping that from taking place. And so this is the.
It's weird. It's really weird.
And yet it makes perfect sense if you're looking at it from a political standpoint of an agenda that a certain group are pushing.